Good afternoon, and welcome to the Dean's Lecture Series. We're going to get started. If you'd like to grab food and drink and have a seat. We are delighted to welcome Teru Clavel as our speaker today for the Dean's Lecture Series. Teru is not only an alum of the School of Education, she is an education expert, columnist, and sought-after public speaker. Since 2010, she's run her own educational consulting practice, advising globally minded families on a range of issues that include multiple language acquisition, school choice, and how to enroll their children in United States universities. Teru has written columns on education for both the Japan Times and the Financial Times, and she's made appearances on CBS This Morning, CNBC Squawk Box, and the Channel NewsAsia. Teru spent a decade raising her family in Asia, and while there she obtained a master's in comparative international education from our own School of Education here at Drexel University. She recently returned to New York with her family. She will be speaking today about her new book, World Class: One Mother's Journey Halfway Around the Globe in Search of the Best Education for Her Children. After Teru's talk, we will have a book signing in the back. I will now turn it over to Teru.
Thank you all for coming today. What I'm going to ask everybody to do is, can we fill up the front a little more? I would love that if some people from the back could maybe fill up these seats. Would people do that? And then, can the people from the back do it? Does that be okay?
Don't be shy.
I want this to be, I start a lot of my talks with education can be a very contentious topic. Everybody has an opinion about education the way they do about politics and money. You're not supposed to really talk about it at the dinner table. Religion. And I'd like to have as much of a civil discussion as possible about a different viewpoint. So thank you very much. And I will also preface this by saying it was my publisher who called me an education expert because I feel like I'm in the room with people who have much more expertise than I do. And I appreciate so many of the professors here who taught me and who continue to teach upcoming teachers, and I was in the global and international education program. So thank you very, very much. So I'm going to get started. So my book, World Class, just came out with Simon & Schuster imprint Atria last month. And it basically chronicles my having raised my kids from 2006 through 2018. And we started in New York City prior to 2006, and then we were in Hong Kong from 2006 until 2010. And that was where my third child was born. And then we moved to Shanghai in 2010, and we're there until 2012. And then from 2012 to 16, we were in Tokyo, and then moved back to the US, but to California, not to New York City. We're in Palo Alto for 2 years. And then finally last summer, moved back to New York City. Finally. So it was literally around the world. I would like to ask here, who here is on the faculty? Oh wow, so you have a lot to teach me. I hope I can teach you something. And who are master's students?
They're probably online.
They're online, okay. And PhD?
Yep.
Well, you all have so much to teach me. So thank you, I feel very honored that you are all here. Okay, this works. Okay, so the book chronicles 2006 to 2018, and I did enroll in Drexel's Graduate in International Education program in the fall of 2011 and graduated in 2014. And I would be remiss in not thanking Rebecca Clothy, who was the head of the department at the time and absolutely instrumental. And where's Samantha? And Samantha knows she was my online person whenever there was any glitch, big or small, because I was making a joke at our lunch earlier that at the time I didn't know anything about online education, let alone going back to school later in life. So I printed everything out, and I probably emailed Samantha about how to use a printer. So thank you very much, Samantha. And when I finished the Drexel program, that led me into a career as an education journalist, and I was based in Japan at the time, and I loved it. I was so passionate about international education, and the joke I kind of make is that when I came back to the United States in 2016, and people said, oh, what did you write about? I said, international education. They're like, what's that? What's international education? Because where I was overseas, especially in China, learning English was kind of the golden ticket to success in your future. And everybody was talking about coming to the United, not everybody, but it was very aspirational to come to the United States to go to college or to come to graduate school. And in Japan too, there is such an effort to try to get the younger generation to speak English. And then I returned to the United States in 2016, and there was this reverse culture shock. When I left, Obama hadn't even been elected yet, and I come back with 3 children, and we had another presidential election. And so I kind of look at the US as, I thought my children were so lucky. We all had US passports, which meant that we were welcomed in all these countries, and we're so proud to be American. And then what does it mean to be part of a democracy? And then we come back to the United States. So it's very interesting that from 2016, their view of what it means to be a US citizen, US passport holder, American, may be very different had we have not left when we had. So actually, I'm gonna go back just a minute. I wanna ask why international education matters to every educator in the US. Can someone try to answer that question, a few people? I'm gonna call on you, and I'm probably gonna call Rebecca because she was, does anybody wanna venture to, yes?
Well, and your comments about coming back to the United States, and we think we're the center of the universe, but we're not anymore. I think we're in the United States, and especially the education system, we're going through a lot of growing pains trying to understand that we're part of a larger global education process, and our students need to be globally not only aware, but globally literate. And it matters, and we're not good at seeing that yet. The rest of the world is ahead of us.
I love that answer. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, as the song says, it's a small world after all. It seems like you have more international travelers. People are going across borders now. But I know when I was in the school, specifically when they're teaching math, our students here don't really understand a lot of the concepts, geometry and things like that. Whereas I think in Japan, they have a better way of teaching it so that you understand it better instead of memorization and bringing formulas and trying to plug in that way. They teach differently so that children will understand exactly what it is that you're doing. So I think international education, finding other methods from abroad to see if they work here would be wonderful.
Okay, yeah, so that's a great segue. So while we definitely have to examine the culture, the demographic, the politics, the history behind every nation, our practices are very different. However, there are some core principles that high-performing nations do share. And that's what I hope to explore with you today. And if you have a pressing question, please don't hesitate to ask. Our time here is quite limited. I think I have, is it 1 hour to speak and then 15 minutes for Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll try to stick to that. So if you can, hold your questions to the end unless it's something really, really pressing. Okay. Is it gonna work? Okay, here we go. So one of the first classes I took, and I don't know if you all still do this, is what's your educational lens? So I actually start my book in the introduction because I want to be very clear about this is my perspective. We all have different experiences with education. And so I'm very upfront about, literally upfront in my book. So I was educated in a mostly culturally Japanese home. My mom is a first-gen Japanese immigrant, and she was a single mom. I don't have siblings either, so I'm an only child. And going to school, I probably started learning English and speaking English when I was about 3 years old. And at the time, I was probably the only one all through high school who didn't speak English at home. And I felt like kind of the strange poster child on international school days who always had to teach everybody origami. And before they had the Tiger Mom kind of name, I was the one who was in the talent shows playing Beethoven, in 3rd grade. And as much as that may sound, I don't know, at the time people thought it was very accomplished, it just made me feel kind of like an outsider. So I do talk about that in the introduction. So I think it's important, and you're all educators or aspiring educators, so you all know that your lens is really critical to understanding your journey. Oh, so I should just say, this is me at Japanese school in 3rd grade, so you see all my classmates. So in the summers, because my family was in Japan, I would go to school in Japan. So I always had this comparative international kind of background, which drew me really to study in the master's program here. So here I am, 2006, I have 2 babies, and my husband comes home and says, we have a job offer to go to Hong Kong, and it was one of these things where at that point I thought, okay, so I had this multicultural home growing up. I want to give that to my children, but I don't really know how to do that. I'm in New York City. And when the opportunity came up, it was okay. It was kind of a non-thinking, we're just gonna go. Which in hindsight was quite naive of me, I think. But it was an exciting opportunity, and it didn't seem that foreign to me because I was half Asian. And that's how naive I felt and how poor I felt like my education was, because, and I'm very honest about this in world class too, like I couldn't really tell the difference. Oh, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Japan, it's all the same. It's all that part of the world. And it's hugely, hugely different, right? I got a big rude awakening. So I start the book and I talk about the preschool process in New York City, which is likened to a Hunger Games. And it's right because you have to get into these elite preschools that then they think, okay, we'll go into these private schools where the sticker, right, the tuition is $40,000+ a year, and then it can take you straight to the Ivy League or a highly competitive university, which we all kind of know, right, that doesn't necessarily happen, because once you disaggregate for contribution, legacy, connection, sports, what have you, that percentage is completely different based on your socioeconomic background and your resume, really. So in that kind of milieu, if you want to say, in 2006, I didn't know what to do with my kids because I didn't want to participate in that, but I kind of didn't know what else to do because I want to give my kids the best education. So that was another reason I thought, oh, okay, Hong Kong, I'll just escape it all. And that also started making me think about my education values. And I thought, okay, what is an education to me? Is it play? Is it academics? How much time do my kids go to school? Do they have before programs? Do they have after school programs? Do I go back to work? You know, how much money is being spent on their tuition? So how involved am I? Do I teach them Japanese? It's my first language. So all these things were kind of, you know, brewing in my mind. And again, Hong Kong was okay, I can escape all of those things. And part of my journey too, you'll see, is at this point, I don't want to say I'm just a mom because it's definitely the hardest thing that I've ever had to do, but I'm not thinking about education at this point as a scholar or a researcher. I'm really just thinking about it from the perspective of being a mother. So you'll see this journey here and throughout my book. So these are things that you'll probably already think about, but these, you know, this is what I was thinking about. What are the demographics of the students at the school, and then what are your schooling options in your area? So we go to Hong Kong, and at this point, it's 2006. We're there for 4 years, and my third child, Victoria, so a boy, girl, she was born in 2009. And here are these photos, and I'm gonna walk through my educational choices here, but I didn't know anything, right? I'm an expatriate, and everybody said, just put your kids in that preschool, it's down the street. And it was an international for-profit preschool. I thought, okay, I don't know the difference between for-profit, non-profit, public charter, whatever. So I enroll my eldest, who's on the left there, and then it's supposed to be a Mandarin immersion program. But within a month or two, when he's with a bunch of other non-Mandarin speaking students in a Western international kind of environment, he's not picking up any Mandarin, right? And then I started having this kind of identity crisis, thinking, well, then why do we move here if he's not going to learn Mandarin? The local language here is Cantonese anyway. This artifice, what is going on, right? So I talk about this in World Class, where when we first got there, people said, if you want Mandarin immersion, you have to send him to this school, it's in the middle of this and that, you have to go, but no one wants to send their kid there. And I thought, okay, nobody wants to send their child there, but a few months in, I thought, oh my God, we have to go look at this school. It was nicknamed the prison. And it was nicknamed the prison because from the outside, it could actually be mistaken for being a prison. It's just kind of this foreboding, big concrete building with a courtyard in the middle where all the buses would go in and just gas up the place, it felt like. But it had a full immersion Mandarin program. It was 3 hours a day, and it was a public magnet school. So kids all over Hong Kong were bused there. And this is my oldest on the left here, if I get that. This is James. And then Charles, my second one, came. He's in the twos program here. And yes, people thought, for the most part, maybe we were kind of crazy for doing this, but they became fluent Mandarin speakers, and they got a phenomenal education. And that's when they started getting homework. My 3-year-old started getting homework in early childhood education, right, at that age. And the homework was minimal, but it's interesting. I talked to my son, who's now 15, about this. He said, there was so much homework. But maybe, you know, relative for a 3-year-old, it was a lot. He basically had to copy a character every day. whether it be ABC, a number 1, 2, 3, the Chinese 1, 2, 3, or what am I missing? A Chinese character if I didn't say that. And it was just copying it over a few times, but it got him in the habit of always doing homework. And so when I come back to the US and people often ask me, how do you get your kids to do homework? It's such a struggle. I don't really have that conversation with my children because my kids have always done homework. It just comes with the territory of going to school. So again, I talked about the school choice. And then before we actually left Hong Kong in 2010, we didn't know that we were leaving. So we started looking at ongoing schools. Where are my children, my oldest, where's he gonna go to primary school? And we looked around again at international schools. And we made the conscious decision to say, no, we are staying here and we're gonna keep the kids in the local magnet school because this preschool went through to through high school. So that was an interesting decision for us as well because not many expatriate families would make that decision. So again, this is when should you introduce a child to a second language? I'm sure a lot of people here know the neurocognitive science really shows that the earlier you start, the easier it is. You can speak like a native. As you approach adolescence, it becomes more of an additive, non-native speaker kind of a process. So I was very lucky because my children were all young enough to be able to learn to speak these languages. We'll get to Japanese soon as a native speaker. So then we go to Shanghai. And something I didn't talk about when we were in Hong Kong was that you can have a very luxurious lifestyle. And is anybody familiar with this expatriate kind of luxurious lifestyle? Yeah, you can get swept away. And I felt like that kind of went against my values too for my children, where people have helpers and drivers and live in health. And so when the opportunity came for us to move to Shanghai in 2010, and I use this word, it was a little too detoxy. I went to the other end. So this is where we lived. We lived in an old Chinese lane, and this was literally, that's our door right here, and this is what it looked like, and this was our entry area. This was an ex-communist tenement, and we intentionally did this. Most expatriates will live in an all-out development. Many of them will have a grocery store, a club, a fitness center. Some even have attached preschools. And I mean, we didn't have any facilities that we can tell you. And something else that we did was, again, we enrolled our children into the local public schools. And at that point, I had a first grader, a preschooler, and a 1.5-year-old, basically. And everybody again said, are you crazy? You know, this is a communist country. You don't put your non-Chinese children into these schools. And I said, no, that's why we're here. And a lot of people did pull me aside. That's a nice way of saying they thought I was crazy. And I felt vindicated because right when we moved in the fall of 2010, I'm sure people here are familiar with the OECD PISA test, right? That was the first year, that December, that Shanghai participated, right? And if everybody remembers the first year participated, it blew everybody else out of the water in math, reading, and in science. And suddenly I felt so vindicated. I was like, I knew I was doing something right. I put my kids in these schools. And that's my son. That's his first grade classroom. And you see here he's in a second grade classroom. And he's got 2 stripes. And does anybody here know what that is? Anyone want to venture a guess? Anyone?
Medium, like a middle leadership.
Middle leadership, yep. So this is, every day he very proudly wore his patch. There was 1 3-stripe, which is the number 1. In his class there were 2 stripes, and there were 3 12 stripes. And it's basically leadership, academic leadership, social leadership. And he was so proud, right, because he was basically number 2 in the class. And you can see the red bow or tie around his neck, and that meant he joined the Communist Party. And in the 2nd grade, which is a whole other story I talk about in world class, because I didn't know he had done that, and he was so proud. But you know, I'm getting a little bit of education. So there you have it. And something else, mastery, right? It's such a big word, I feel like, in our education system today. And though they don't use those words there was one day, and this is a story I tell in world class, I had 3 kids in a country that had a 1-child-only policy. And I don't speak Mandarin. Now I can get by, but at the time I didn't. And I had to pick up my first son at his school, public school, and then I had to pick up my younger 2 who are at their preschool. And we're here legally, but we're kind of not. These days it's very hard to enroll a non-Chinese non-Shanghai resident into a local public school. But at the time, we kind of cut corners, we kind of were allowed to. So I'm not making a fuss, right? Because I'm just happy he's having the experience. One day I go to pick him up and I have to get him out at the right time because otherwise I can't pick up my other two. He's in the room, he's not coming out, the other kids are filtering out. And I'm just standing outside the classroom and he's sitting by his math teacher. And there are a handful of kids there. Slowly, the kids are filing out, they're doing some kind of math homework. And I'm looking in the classroom going, we have to go, you know, because I can't communicate. The cell phone, the communication was pretty sparse back then as well. And frankly, I couldn't speak Mandarin, so I can't communicate to the preschool that I'm gonna be late. So he's in there for a minimum of an hour. And I'm going crazy. He's not a discipline case, why is he there? He likes math, why is he? And so he starts crying. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, this is abuse. Like what is this, you know, I'm very, very upset. Finally, he leaves the classroom, he's crying. We get in the car, and then we pick up the other two. And that story really stuck with me, and I couldn't figure out why that whole thing happened, right? And I'm writing world class, I'm writing the book, and I kept thinking about it and thinking about it. And then I realized he wasn't crying because he was kept after school. He was crying because of me, because I was putting pressure on him to leave. So the question is, why was he still there? Because his classroom teacher had a 95% minimum to be considered mastering the material. And she kept she kept students after school until as long as it took for the kids to get that 95%. And she would talk to the families, she would talk to the other students in the classroom to pair them up, a stronger student with a lesser performing student, let's say. She would get other families, if they were so wonderful, they would pair me up with another family if I didn't understand what was going on. And they used every community resource, and sometimes these kids would stay after school and be served dinner by their teachers until they mastered the material. And you know, when you talk about the learning credentials, or the learning, let's say, attainment of these kids, the PISA scores will show you that in math and science, our 18-year-olds are performing at the level of the 15-year-olds in some of these countries. Right, so when you think about that, and I will tell you, and I'll fast forward just a bit just to let you know, when we came back to the United States, I had a 5th grader and I had a 7th grader. They were performing 2 years ahead of math. And that was not with supplementing, it was just because of what they learned in the classroom. And I'm the first person to say, and I know this is being on video, but my oldest is not, like math is not his jam. He's not in love with math. But he performed at the average expectation of the other students that were around him. My second is a little different. He really does love math. So that's just the question of mastery. And something else that was really hugely kind of shocking to me was this whole notion of, we talked about this, globalization and global competence. Because overseas, that thirst for being global is ever present. Does anybody, I'm sure you know, EF, English first, EF schools. I mean, you can't walk down the street, I felt like, without a flyer or an umbrella or a car that said EF, because everybody's trying to learn, right? Because everybody's trying to learn English there. It's a huge, huge business for everybody to try to learn English. And when we were there in Shanghai, 1st graders started learning English, and it was considered the 3rd most important class after Chinese language and math. And in 1st grade, you know, a lot of these kids couldn't speak any English. And we would go back and visit every year, and by 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, these kids were conversant in English. And their teacher, so my first homeroom teacher was actually the English teacher. It was very nice. They assigned the English teacher to be the conduit for me in the school. She looked like she was about 15 years old, didn't even have a passport, never left China, and she spoke perfect local English to the point where she would drop something, she was like, oopsie daisies, ouch, you know, it was remarkable. She spoke perfect English, and anytime she could, she would ask me for resources. What books should my kids read? What are the phonics programs that you like? She just was so hungry for content. It was really, really touching. And at the same time, I started working with Chinese students who wanted to come to US universities. And that was a hugely eye-opening experience. And I did that actually because of a Drexel course I took on globalization. And I was like, oh my gosh, who are these students who are wanting to come to the US? I said, I want to work with them. I didn't do it for the money, I got paid pennies really. But I did it because I wanted to understand these students. I was just saying, I started working with some students who, I started with students who were at this high school called Fudan Fuzhong, which is a feeder for Fudan University, which is one of the top universities in China. And their work ethic, being with these students who are between 16 and 18 years old. I had never seen anything like it before. They were so, I would tell them, you know, you haven't read any English literature or American literature. You have to quote these things, you have to know what's going on in the world. I mean, I will tell you, one student wrote a whole essay for me on how Genghis Khan was the savior of all mankind. And you know, so I was like, no, we have to kind of backtrack here, and you're not gonna submit that. But these students were voracious readers. And if anybody knows anything about the college applications to the most competitive schools, it's really hard to recycle those essays. They're really kind of unique to each school. And they would write and rewrite and rewrite these essays 20 times, 30 times. I would cross it out and say no. And they would turn it around in 12 hours. They were, I mean, to a point, it was a little too much. I mean, they take pictures of what they wanted to wear to the interview. Should I wear this blush? No, that's okay. But it was so intense, and I was very strict too, because I said, you know, if you are going to take a place at one of these top universities, you have to earn it, right? So I made sure that they would be as prepared as possible, but also be contributing to the school and the classroom. So they would have that kind of creative and critical thinking. So that was an incredible experience too. And I want to talk about global competence in general. Because it's something that was brought up in how do we teach our kids in the US about being globally competent. And it's about seeing something bigger than yourself, right? Seeing problems that are larger. How can you contribute to making the world around you better? And I'll talk about that a little more when we get to Japan. So here's some questions. I'm just going to let you read them pretty quickly, stuff that we've talked about. But I will mention something else, and again, we are going on to Tokyo, or Japan. What are the learning expectations you have for your kids in your classroom? And I've heard, you know, it's so arbitrary, because a classroom teacher can say it's an 80, it's a 95, what's on it, how many times do you take a test? In this country, I've heard repeatedly, we suffer from 12th place trophies, participation trophies. Does there always have to be a winner? How do we build resiliency when these kids are getting multiple tries? Our anxiety levels are skyrocketing at the adolescent and now younger ages. So what are we doing? Is this correlated? These are things that I would like all of us to consider. I just went to my daughter, so she goes to a Saturday Japanese school for Japanese expatriates who are in the US, so she can maintain her Japanese, and she goes back to school to go to regular local public school in Japan every summer. And she just had her classroom observation. And the teacher there said, the mastery level is an 80%. You have to get at least an 80%. And because we're not in Japan, the school was so stringent as to say, there are lots of kids who want to come to this school. If you don't maintain an 80%, you're not welcome to stay here next year. Right? So it's interesting, I think, is where educators, we have to think about what does mastery really mean? And the OECD will define it as, it's not the knowledge, the content, it's how you apply that to the greater world. And that's, I think, something that a lot of people may miss, because they think it's just about maybe rote learning, your arithmetic, your grammar, your spelling, all that kind of stuff. But I'll say something that does personally bother me is that we're not teaching some of these fundamentals anymore, and there's no way that you can appreciate Shakespeare if you don't know grammar. There's no way you can be good at calculus if you don't know your algebra, right? And I've interviewed, so the 2017 to 18 academic year, I went across the country and I visited dozens of schools, talked to scholars, went to conferences. And I write about this in world class as well. There are plenty of teachers out there who will say, these kids are basically gonna have iPads embedded in or iPhones or whatever embedded in their hands, so they don't have to learn arithmetic. You know, they don't have to know grammar. They can just copy paste, they have spell check, they have all this other stuff. But it's the brain that's actually not being used. Like, your brain is atrophying if you don't do this stuff, if you don't handwrite. And there are plenty of teachers you may have heard who have issues because when they try to get their kids to write, within one page of handwriting, they have children complaining that their hands cramp up, right? Or now there's a movement that they can't use red pens in schools because that hurts kids, right? And then there are so many books that kids aren't allowed to read anymore, which, I mean, Little House on the Prairie made it to the no read list. You know, so how much are we protecting our kids? How much are we asking of them? It's just something to consider, because it's very different where I was. Let me check the time quickly. Okay for time. So then in 2012, we had the opportunity to go to Tokyo, which I will say was bittersweet because we had family in Tokyo. But at the same time, I felt like we were just starting to reap the rewards of having been in Shanghai, which was a difficult place for me to adjust to. My kids got along very, very swimmingly, why don't I put it that way, but it was very hard for me. We lived with termites and cockroaches and rats, and we didn't have hot water, and electricity was sparse, and it went on and on. But it really toughened me up, and it made me appreciate so much. I mean, when I say we lived in a place, in an old lane, we went to China in part because I had these romantic notions of a country that's growing at a 10+% annual GDP, growth, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's the gold rush of my generation. I can't wait to go. And what that actually means is that nothing stays the same, right? I mean, you can go to a hairdresser one week, and the next month you go, it's not there anymore. You can go to one part of the city, and then 4 months later, it's an entirely new Gotham. Like, it's just high rises everywhere. And so that was really jarring for me, but within that, my kids really thrived, which I think, and I bring that up in part because I think, I don't mean to offend anyone, anything I say, please disagree with me. But there's kind of this negative connotation that a lot of Asian students are not creative, and they may not be flexible thinkers. And what I would say is, if you're living in China, and you're experiencing that kind of growth on a regular basis, you're pretty adaptable and pretty flexible. I'm the one who couldn't get along. And I grew up in New York, and Frank Sinatra's, you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. My joke was, no, if you can make it in Shanghai, you can make it anywhere. Okay. So here we are, we go to Tokyo, and that's my middle son. Again, we're in local public schools. And at this time, my kids can't speak a word of Japanese. I didn't teach them anything. And they present as Caucasian. So when I looked at these local public schools, everybody said, okay, we'll give you 5 years. Then maybe they can catch up, reading, writing, and learning. But they hadn't really worked with students whose native language was English, but they had already mastered Mandarin, or were reading, writing, and speaking in Mandarin. So my kids were up at grade level. So at that point, I had a first grader, a second grader, and a preschooler. And they were at grade level within a handful of months. So they thought my kids were rocket scientists. I didn't tell them, yeah, they kind of know this stuff already. But, because it's similar, the written word. And so something that is really important that you've probably heard a lot about, I'm just going to go a little deeper into it, is the notion of community and whole child in Japan. And I'm sure, I just want a show of hands. How many people here know that 6-year-olds in Japan are expected to be independent? Independent. Okay, so I would have thought more you knew this, but kids at 6 years old, they're raised by 6 years old to be going to and from school on their own, and oftentimes to their after-school activities on their own, and that can include walking, public transportation, which is a bus, it could be a train, it could be all modes of transportation at 6 years old. And so how do they get that, right? It's an interesting kind of process. So here you see, this is I think he's in 2nd grade, and he's just walking home with his friends. I used to kind of follow them, and of course it's not cool, so he told me to go away. This is one of the photos. And how they do this is part of the community. They have this program, Tokkatsu, and it's whole child learning. So what they do is they don't have a janitorial staff. They don't have a cafeteria staff. Everybody, when they take their pencil cases to school, they also take a rag. And that rag has to be cleaned every day, every week. They literally get on all fours and run up and down the corridors, if you've seen these videos, right? Mopping the floor with their rag. They clean the chalkboards, they clean the toilets, they serve each other lunch, they clean up after lunch. And what that teaches these kids really, and it's very intentional, is to not only take care of themselves, but to take care of the larger community. That's their classroom. And that started at such a young age. And the way I want to say it kind of manifests itself, where you can see into larger society, is, after the World Cup game, there was all this footage a few years ago. And the Japanese are amazing. They don't leave any rubbish anywhere, and they carry their own plastic bags, and they go around the stadium and they even clean up other people's garbage. Because they're always they're taught to look out for their neighbor. And so something else that was really interesting is when they've had kind of natural disasters, when there was the Kobe earthquake, or when they had the Fukushima national disaster, there's no looting. People are standing in line and they're waiting, and the elders are taken care of, and the younger kids are taken care of. And there's so much discipline and order, because the communitarian respect is so strong there. And it's really taught from early childhood education. Here are their photos of elementary, but these are but it really starts in elementary school. So something else, so my youngest started at 3 years old in a preschool there. And it really, they start so young. The teachers will tell you, do not do things for them. Don't pack their bags for them. Don't unpack their bags for them. Make sure they get dressed on their own. And the teachers will tell you, please, there's mandatory parent education. So to opt out, you actually have to write a letter and get permission to not show up, right? And that's very different. And so people often look at my daughter, she's 10 years old, she's in 4th grade, and they're amazed because she's so organized and she's so independent. And I would love to take credit for that, but a lot of it has to do with how she was educated in the Japanese school system. So let's keep going. See. Something else that was really not surprising, but I should say amazing to me was a teacher training. And I'd love afterwards to hear what your thoughts are on this too. But basically, let's go back. So this, if you can read this says teacher's room. And the US education system is criticized for a lot of things, but one thing is the lack of horizontal and vertical alignment, right? Horizontal amongst grade level teachers, and then vertical between grades, between elementary, middle, and high school. And after school, every single day, every teacher leaves their classroom. They only stay in the classroom if the kids are in there. And they come to this, it's called shokuinshitsu. And it's a room it's not a lounge. Everybody's desk is there, they're all lined up, and they collaborate there for basically 3 to 4 hours, unless they're running some kind of a club activity. Teachers in Japan, I believe, I'll have to look at the latest data, but they work longer than almost any other OECD nation in the school. And they spend a majority of that time collaborating with other teachers, not necessarily in the classroom. So it's remarkable to me, because every time I would call the school, and maybe it was because I'm the only one with kind of multiple Western children in the school, but they know, because there's no cafeteria staff, there's no administrative staff, it was always a teacher, or no one would pick up the phone, or the headmaster, or the principal, or the vice principal. And so, oh, hi, Charles, James, they're doing great, and they knew everything about my children. It didn't matter who picked up the phone. And there are literally 500 to 600 kids in the school, because they're in this room for multiple hours, problem solving together and collaborating. And then the teacher training, something else about it is, it's a desirable, respected profession in Japan. And that's a huge difference. And I'll interject my opinion, that we definitely have to change that here. So for 38,000 spots, this is the most recent data, for 38,000 spots, there are 200,000 applicants. And it's just as hard to become a teacher in places like Tokyo and Shanghai as it is to pass the bar or your medical school boards here. So imagine what that feels like to be a respected teacher, right, in Japan, right? I think about it as when you have people over at a dinner party, and let's say you had a doctor and a lawyer and a teacher at the dinner table. In this country, it would be very different from if you had the same scenario overseas. And also, the character for teacher in Chinese and in Japanese is future leader of the future, is actually the character. And every time you say the teacher's name, it's not, Miss Smith or Mrs. Smith or Mr. Smith. It's Smith Lao Shi or Smith Sensei. So every time you're saying the teacher's name, you are saying, like, teacher leader of the future. It's already an honorific that's built in. And in Japan, the kids, before they stand up or they raise their hand, before they're called on, they oftentimes, not always, but most classrooms, they stand up, push their chair in, and then they speak, and then they do the same thing at the end, right? They sit back down. And before every class, you bow to the teacher and you say thank you. And at the end of the class, you do the same thing. You bow every single class. So there's so much respect already inherently built into that system that is pretty remarkable. And something else that I'll talk about is, how do you communicate with your families? Right, something that I thought was so different in both Shanghai and in Tokyo than what I see here is that kind of that perfectly triangulated relationship, right, between the teacher, the parent, and the student. And here, there's a daily journal that goes between the teacher and the family. And it could be about anything. It could be, he's having struggling with some kind of a character, he had an upset stomach, literally anything. He had a fight with his sibling today, he may be in a bad mood. And these teachers have, on average, at the elementary level, about 35 kids per class. 32 to 35, depending on the grade in elementary school. And the teacher goes through every single one of these journals every day and makes a comment back. And it goes back and forth every single day. Something else I will say, and in Shanghai, I'm just going to go back because it's about the teacher and that triangulated relationship. Guess how many pages the report card was for my elementary school son in Shanghai? Anybody want to venture a guess? 10 pages? Anybody else? 46 pages.
Wow.
And when I first got it, I thought, this is just going to be all, I'm in a Chinese school, it's all going to be, he knows his math, he knows his arithmetic, he knows whatever, it's just going to be all about the academics. No such thing. For starting in first grade, there's subject-specific teachers. So we had an English teacher, a science teacher, a math teacher, a reading teacher. And every teacher, for every subject, were morals, ethics, arts, there were a bunch of different subjects. The top half was about the academics. The second was about contribution to the class, motivation, things like that. And the 46 pages also required not only the teacher's comments, but the parent comment and the student comment, which I thought was brilliant. And there you have a perfectly triangulated relationship. And I used to love going to pickup and seeing, oftentimes it was the grandparents. Both parents often worked and the grandparents would pick up the kids. So I'm there with a bunch of grandparents and you'd see them talking to the teacher and looking at the child, talking to the teacher. And that meeting was so important because so much was invested in that one princeling child, because at the time it was a one-child policy. Mm-hmm. Parent involvement. So let me check the time quickly. Okay, so this was another thing that was pretty shocking. I tell this story in the book, and I'll just give you a brief overview. But in elementary school, the public school, the typical requirement is that one parent has to volunteer for a full year, mandatory, for each child they have in the school. And then you kind of wonder why the birth rate is going down, right? Yeah. Right? So, but that's a requirement. And this can be a full-time job. I mean, you can literally be at the school for 40 hours with your requirement. And I admit, I kind of played the I don't speak Japanese card, so I got out of this. But you're not supposed to. But literally, if you are Japanese, the only way you could get out of this requirement at my son's particular school was if you were ill and had a doctor's note, if you were pregnant and had a doctor's note, or if you were planning on getting pregnant and had a doctor's note. And you had to make this public to everybody because it was your responsibility. And if you didn't carry your weight, someone else was going to carry your burden for you. And I saw a fight like this go on, which is highly amusing. I hope you read the book and you can see it. And something else that's really interesting, and I'll just throw this out there as a little story. You know, rock, paper, scissors. I think Japan has like thousands of iterations of that. I mean, they dance to it. They have curry rice kind. They have like, it's a fascinating thing. So much is determined on rock, paper, scissors because it's arbitrary, right? You're not going to fight about it. It's not this. It's not fair. It took 20 hours. It's just, and literally, you can get your PTA assignment where it can be 10 hours a week or 40 hours a week for an entire year based on rock, paper, scissors. Okay? So in my daughter's preschool, this is me. I was on the games committee, and it took up, I want to say 20 hours a week for about 6 months. And we would go to, it was called the 100 yen shop. It's like the dollar store there. And you buy all the supplies to make all the games, and it was so ritualistic, right? Every single thing you purchased had to be presented. We were told to wear navy dresses, actually suits, when we presented to the entire school. And there was like, you had to go to this level to get this approved. Then it had to go to the next level. And then the school head had to approve it. And while it was absolutely maddening at times, because you probably couldn't get an approval for 3 weeks on something as small as purchasing a sponge, literally, there was order to it. And I just contrast that to, let's think about the curricular reforms that we have in our classrooms now, right? Or if you're a teacher, you can say, oh, I found a cool app tonight, I'm gonna use it for my kids tomorrow. And then sometimes our kids get lost in this, right? When there are a lot of holes, and then one teacher does it this way, and then the next year teacher, and then you don't have all that alignment. Japan is almost like probably the exact opposite, because things aren't changing that rapidly. Something else, and we'll talk about this very briefly, I think, in the next few slides about education governance is, curricular reforms in Japan happen every 10 years. And there's a Ministry of Education with teachers that study every single reform that will take place. It's a highly centralized system. In Shanghai, we were in Shanghai, but China is much more decentralized, but the educational reforms aren't as rapid as they are here, and there is a very strict, what should I say, like a approval process that happens at the provincial levels and at the first, second, and third tier district, departments of education. So here's some questions to consider if you are practicing or hoping to be a teacher. But a lot of it, I feel like what's so important is how do you plan on collaborating with your families? And something I thought was so interesting, I'm sure people here are very familiar, Joyce Epstein's six types of parental involvement. I worship that woman, I'll just say. When I first met her, I thought I was meeting a superhero. But what's so interesting is it kind of doesn't exist, I felt like, where I was, because it's a parental involvement is just so obvious, and it's very common what's expected of you where I was in Asia. Whereas here, you know, do you get involved with the PTA? Do you go read to your child? Like, what are you supposed to do as a parent? Do you give money to the booster organization? Do you go to the library? Are you supposed to be involved with your son's PTA when he's in high school? Are you supposed to run for the school board? There's so many things. It's almost like you need a manual for parent involvement in this country, and that's very different from where I was. And then we wanted to come back. So 2016, we go to Palo Alto. And reverse culture shock, rude awakening. I put my kids in the local public schools again. I'm just gonna check the time. We're still good. And I'm just gonna bullet point for you what we came back to. I had, at that point, a 7th grader, a 5th grader, and a 2nd grader. So I had 2 in elementary and 1 in middle school. And within 1 year, there are 5 secondary schools in Palo Alto. All 5 secondary school heads quit. The superintendent quit. My 5th grader had 5 classroom teachers that year. My middle schooler was on the 4th principal in 4 years. And we're talking about a district that was ranked #1 by, I believe it was niche.com, 2 years running, and has some of the most educated, affluent taxpayers probably of any city maybe in the country, right? We're talking about Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, Google, right, Apple, they're all right there. And this is what's happening in Palo Alto. And sometimes I'd be looking at my friends, my parent friends, and say, why isn't this making national headlines? Like, why don't people know about this? And when you think about it, why isn't it, right? And it's interesting, and it's because there are lots of things happening in Palo Alto, including it having been a relatively sleepy college town, maybe a generation earlier, it's in the backyard of Stanford. And then now you have a huge influx of Silicon Valley money and a lot of international families coming in with a very different set of expectations and values. So it was almost like an anthropological study when you went to the board meetings, because you have these Chinese families petitioning for, how should I say, higher learning expectations, math tracking. They wanted to, what's the word I'm looking for, when you put your GPA, you can put it to a 4.5 or a 5.0 depending on your AP or a
Weighted GPA.
Weighted GPA, that's the word I'm going to thank you. They wanted to weight the GPAs. And this is a district, right, that had, this was very well known. They had 2 suicide clusters, right, because of all the stress in Palo Alto. But yet you had this influx of new people coming in saying they wanted to weight the GPA, which just makes it a more competitive, right, because then you want to take the honors and the AP courses rather than the electives in classes that you may not get a higher, like the opportunity to get a 5.0. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and I kind of thought, wait, what's going on? I'm supposed to be in this really, really great school district, and it was very, very difficult to even get my kids in the right math class because they didn't have a track record of where they had come from in the US system. And this is when the equity story really, I mean, if I were to pick one thing that's wrong with the education system, I would say equity, right? And it's not about spending $10 for this child and 10 for another. It's about making up the difference. And you know, in some states, in New York City, 20,000 plus per pupil is spent. In Utah, where I spent some time too, you're looking at just over $7,000 per pupil, right? And this is adjusted for cost of living. And then we wonder, do teachers want to go into this profession? Do they get paid? Do they have to have multiple jobs to make a living? In Palo Alto, where I was, and in Menlo Park, the neighboring town, guess what the average teacher salary was? 70,000?
Yeah.
Any other guesses? 50? $120,000.
Wow. And they still couldn't afford to live.
And they still can't afford to live there. They still can't retain teachers, right? And these teachers oftentimes had to leave their homes between 5 and 6 a.m. to beat the traffic. Otherwise, it could take 2 hours to get there from where they lived. And while I would love the teachers to stay after school, to stay with my kids, if they don't get out the door by 3 o'clock, they hit that traffic going home. So we're not even talking about, tenure and unions. We're just talking about pure logistics and cost of living. So there are all these equity issues, and I'm sure we could have, God only knows how many volumes of books and conversation about this, but it really struck me because where I was, there were some practices that would prevent students from having different kinds of experiences. So let me give you a few examples. In Japan, the school year ends mid-March, and then it begins April 1. And our first year there, go to school April 1, and there are all these new teachers, the older, I'm like, wait, there wasn't an announcement, where did these teachers go? The district shuffles teachers around every 2 to 3 years, both for their own professional development, but for equity. So you don't have good schools and bad schools, which was brilliant. And then to avoid the lack of horizontal and vertical alignment issues that you may have, in elementary school, for example, the teachers rarely stay in the classroom in the same grade level for more than 1 year. So 1 year they're teaching first grade, the next year they're teaching sixth, elementary goes 1 through 6. The next year fourth, third, and that's part of their career development. And it helps the kids too, right? And I'm not saying every teacher in Japan is great. That doesn't happen. There are plenty of stories where you get stuck with a not great year, let's say. Because there's some teachers who, and they'll admit it, I'm better with first graders than I am with first graders and sixth graders, right? But it helps with the equity issue, really. And in China, there are lots of situations where they will take a struggling school and pair it with a successful school, let's call it, and the successful school will take over the management of the lesser performing school. Or they will have some kind of partnership where the more thriving school will be penalized if the lesser one is not performing. This is a big one, and this is one of the last topics I'm going to talk about. Education funding. This was huge to me too, because within the first week that my 5th grader was in the classroom, he was given an iPad. No parent was told. The teacher was new, and she was 8 months pregnant, and she said there was no controls on the iPads. It was something the PTA had fundraised for and gave them to the 5th grade. And she told the kids, I use my iPad for everything. I read everything on here. You can download whatever you want. Here you go. So I go to his room at night, and there's something glowing under his sheet because he's on the iPad, right? And I'm going, so I go to the principal. I said, listen, I'm new here. I'm new to the country, basically. Like, is this a normal thing? And he goes, the kids aren't having iPads. What are you talking about? I said, no, the kids got them. So he didn't even know, right? And this was something that was kind of a rude awakening because this was the pervasive kind of practice within Palo Alto. At least, yes, it was, but I'll just speak to what I know in this classroom. So then I started thinking about, so who's driving this technology? Because where we were, there was no technology in the classrooms. And if you look at who's majoring in the STEM fields in this country, both at the undergrad and who's coming to the graduate schools, especially in engineering, they're Asian students, primarily Chinese and Indian. They don't have technology in the classrooms. And there's more and more research that shows, right, the American Academy of Pediatrics even has studies, McKinsey, the OECD, they're all saying technology actually can hurt learning outcomes. But yet, in this country, we're pushing one-on-one, starting in early childhood education, right? So that was a really, really, really big shock to me. And then I tell a story in my book where, I don't know if you're familiar with the app Class Dojo. And I used to drive on 101, and I used to see the Class Dojo building, and I'd be like, oh, I guess it's so bad. Because my son would get a grade every day on his behavior. And it was 10 different points, all social points. And if he didn't get a 90%, he got a big fail. And I'm like, oh my God, my kid is failing social skills every day. But this teacher had 20-something students, and she's like on her phone, instead of just telling my kid, maybe you can quiet down. Maybe you can sit quietly, or whatever it is. Instead, she's doing this, and I was like, let alone the privacy issues. And what if he wants to run for president and someone finds out he can't sit still? You know what I mean? I was like, this is, but then I wonder who's driving all of this curricular reform and the education governance in our system. Because where I came from, you couldn't just implement a curricular reform overnight, and it was it was regulated far better by higher up government levels. And I'm not looking at my notes, so I hope I'm not missing anything too big. Let's see. Okay, so, I think it's just important to know where your mandates are coming from and why you're doing what you're doing in your classrooms. I read, maybe it was an Ed Week article, about a teacher who was so excited to use Alexa in her classroom because it reminded her when her students needed to take medication. And I was thinking, that must be a violation of so many levels, I didn't even know. Right? So, and I understand our classrooms are highly underfunded, right? I think teachers spend several hundreds of dollars every year to get supplies for their classrooms, which is an atrocity, right? So I understand when Apple comes in and says, oh, I'm gonna make you Teacher of the Year, I'm gonna give you all this technology, but I think we just have to be so mindful of what this is actually doing to our kids, because I miss those days when the math teacher saw where the kid was making the mistake in their problem solving, right? And kids these days really, they don't have the stamina that we used to see, the resiliency, and it's, where are they getting that from? Because back in the day when I went to college, I'm 46 years old, and I got those blue books for the exam, and you made a mistake and you're writing in pen, I mean, you may as well fail the class, right? There's no deleting and going back and doing all that stuff. There's much more accountability in every thought for every word. And these days, like, it's not what's retained, how much investment is being put into the learning. So here's some final parting thoughts. Of course, the last is most important. Please buy and read World Class, or listen to the audio. I did the audio recording. And I do think it's so important that we learn from other education systems and what they are doing right. They're not doing everything right. And I talk about that in World Class too. I mean, there are definitely issues in some of these countries. And after the PISA scores came out, actually, I went to the head of my son's elementary school. And it was previously called a key school. They're not supposed to be called that anymore. It was a tier 1 school in Shanghai. So basically, there are educational reforms that take place. They happen there, they work, and then they disseminate and teach the other schools in the district. So he went to one of the top schools. So I went to the principal of the school, and she was there for 18 years, I believe. Very, very respected in the district. And I said, very naively, I said, oh my gosh, you must be so excited. The PISA scores came out, and Shanghai is so good. She was so mad at me. Are you kidding? Look at this place. We don't have proper gym facilities. Look at our art room. Look at music. We have so much left to do. This is not acceptable. And that's when I realized any critique that is going on of the Chinese education system, just you wait. Because they are on a mission, and during the State of the Union address that Xi Jinping gave, he mentioned education dozens of times. The other night, I watched if anybody watched the debate, the 4th Democratic debate, I don't think education was mentioned once. Right? So, with that said, I'd love to open it up to any questions you may have.
I think your presentation was tremendous, and I like a lot of what you're talking about, and I read this book, Surpassing Shanghai, and a lot of it is mentioned in there. But just the other day, I was reading about these private schools in China that are using AI, very individual, students working on a computer and moving in that direction, and that seems to be grabbing hold, at least in certain areas. So I was just wondering if you had any knowledge of that, because it seems counter to what you're saying, the way it really exists over there, or maybe that's just Shanghai, and this is occurring elsewhere.
It's not my area of expertise for sure, and I'm sure there are students here who could address that. But for the most part, technology is still very limited in the classrooms, and phones aren't even allowed in the schools, and it's very heavily monitored. So if they're doing something like that, it would be on a much smaller scale. This is what I'm guessing. I would ask everybody to do their own searches on their own. but it would be kind of a small story that's gaining a lot of traction. There's no question we all have to face AI and what's going on. I would make the argument that because AI is coming and technology is so strong, our human skills of connecting the dots is that much more important, right? So I can't address that, but I would say what's interesting about that probably is, oh, this is a good story. So I'm in my GIE program. I forget who exactly was teaching it, and it was a policy class. And I decided I was going to take the education policy for my son's elementary school in Shanghai. And I can't read Chinese, right? So I had someone translate it for me. And then I compared it to recent research that I just happened to come across from the Graduate School of Education from Harvard. And it was verbatim. And I was going, wow, they are on it. So I would say they're watching this like a hawk and figuring out how to raise this next generation to be as economically viable and productive for the country as possible. That would be my assessment, but definitely. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the AI and the newest technology that they use in private schools are usually after-school programs.
Yes.
And the kids are usually from wealthy families, and they pay for those programs. They want to actually motivate to improve their own learning. So they are not common, and most schools in China are actually public schools. So the technology is really new. At least when I was going to school, I couldn't use cell phones at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was just confirmed. I would also say that if you do any research on this, I think it's really important to disaggregate too when technology is used by kids, because there's lots of data out there that say, oh, kids in China and Japan, they have smartphones, they have computers, but they're not used in the classroom. And oftentimes that data is not separated out. So people think, oh, 45% of kids here have it, but they don't, because it's after school. So that's very different. Any other questions? Thoughts, ideas? Yes.
Well, you mentioned in your talk that you found that natural creativity would come out because of their living conditions and things they had to deal with and things of that sort, and that they're very good at doing the math and learning. But what about putting things to use in terms of creativity and developing new products and new ideas? It's been my experience that particularly the Chinese culture and Japanese culture, Russians, really are looking forward. The way that people are prepared in education, it's very regimented and a way of thinking, and they're looking now for people to break out of that pattern. Did you find that at all?
It's kind of what the principal said to me. We're not teaching our kids the arts, sports, music, as well as we should be. It's a really complicated question, right? Because you're talking about 1.35 billion people,
Right.
And that's just China. And even if you say only 1% of that is creative, you're still looking at a more creative population probably than our students here, right? So on scale and relatively, but I think for the most part, because I get asked this question all the time, right? But we're so creative and innovative in this country. And so I want to throw it back and say, so what are we good at here? What are we creating?
Class
And-
dojo.
What's that?
Class dojo.
Class dojo. Yeah, I'll get a grade on it. But when you look at Silicon Valley too, right? What percent of that is actually U.S. citizen, U.S. educated Silicon Valley? So much of that is not. And when you think about and we'll talk about the socioeconomic disparities, the conversations that drive me kind of crazy are, well, look at Mark Zuckerberg and look at these guys or Bill Gates, they're so creative. Do you know how socioeconomically advantaged they were prior to going to Harvard? They went to Harvard for their connections. And then they didn't have to graduate. Because Mark Zuckerberg spoke 7 languages before he got to Harvard, and he went to Phillips Academy Exeter. So when we talk about, and there's this whole conversation we can have about intergenerational mobility, because it's decreasing in this country hugely. You are cursed with what you were born into, right? So we don't leave talent on the table. I really think we need to really teach these kids the basics, the fundamentals, get them right so that they can survive and be creative with the knowledge they have. It's that application. And I can tell, and I talk about this stuff a lot. So I live in New York City, and I went to Carnegie Hall a few weeks ago. It was a Friday night. And I went to a concert by a Japanese conductor, composer. And typically when I go to Carnegie Hall, I bring down the average age by probably 20 years, right? And that's not a compliment to me. It's saying when we don't teach the arts in our schools, we can't support the arts. I wonder what's gonna happen to these institutions. When I went to the Japanese composers concert, I would not be exaggerating if I said 95% of the audience were Asian, and I probably brought up the average by 10 years at least. And you think about how these other countries are educating about music, right? In Japan, to become a teacher, you have to swim every kind of lap or stroke in the pool. You have to be able to twirl on the bar. It's kind of a joke. It's like before the teacher exams, everybody, you see these adults, teachers in training at the playground trying to twirl because that's part of their exam. And they have to be able to play the recorder, sight sing, and sight read and play the piano. That's on top of learning their subjects. So they're getting taught that you're not going to find a Japanese citizen who doesn't know how to play the piano. So who's going to go and appreciate the arts? You know, so it's a really complicated conversation, and I don't want to say we're creative or not creative. I think the future will tell. But what I meant to say more about the change in China is that you have to be so flexible and adaptable if everything around you is changing at such a high rate. So whether or not that translates into creativity is another conversation. But it's something else I also will talk about, and this may be relevant, I hope. I started going to Japan in the 70s, right, pre-bubble period, and then the 1980s were the bubble period, and everybody saw, I mean, money was flying in the sky in Japan in the 80s. Sony, they buy Rockefeller Center, and they've got Toyota, and, you know, so many movies were about that. And then when I went to Shanghai, I felt like it was so similar, like, oh my gosh, this is the same kind of thing happening. So, you know, there's so many amazing architects and artists and such coming from China and Japan. The problem is they don't speak English right now, and English is the most commonly spoken language, so we have Hollywood and people, right, our media is such a strong wheel. But, you know, there are plenty of analysts now that are saying, 10 years from now, currencies aren't going to be pegged to the dollar, they're going to be pegged to the renminbi. They're saying Chinese is going to be the lingua franca. I mean, so we're at a really interesting time right now, and as teachers, we have to prepare our kids for this, because I think, you know, we have to think about, you know, it's so hot in winter now sometimes, and it's stifling in the summer. Can you imagine what it's going to be like 10 to 20 years from now for our kids? It's literally a different world. And that's what we're figuring out how to educate our kids for. So yes, I'm sorry.
So there's a book called Catching Up and Leading the Way, written by this guy named Yang Zhao. When I was in grad school, I had it.
Yep.
And Yang talks about Chinese education and U.S. education. But one of the things that's really important is that when it comes onto PISA or TIMSS or Pearls and that kind of stuff, the U.S. has never been number one in any of those stuff. And those tests started like in the 1950s, 60s, right? Post World War II, right? There's never been number one. But the U.S. was always ahead in terms of productivity, the big economy, and that kind of stuff, and Pearls and that kind of stuff. So in this book, he's making the point that those tests don't really matter. They don't show what, you know, those are tests. You know, the question is, how do you really apply those things later on in life? Which is why a lot of those kids come to college in the U.S., right? So when they talk about those tests, I think they're relevant to what kids know now, but for the long-term projections, the implications of those things are not yet known because of what happens when they come to the U.S. as well. So, you know, it's a lot of confounding, a lot of conflation, so to speak. But in the U.S., and you're saying that in the U.S. for politicians, say we're around 20, we're around 15, but we're never number one.
We're lower than that.
But we were never in the top 10.
But we've been going down
right?
year after year.
Yeah, but the point what Young was making, that what makes the U.S. really good in the latter part, higher education, that kind of stuff, was the early foundation in the arts and the social studies and so forth. And in fact, they've shown that the studies and correlations so that the biggest correlation with ELA, English language arts, that's the correlation for long-term stuff, because in mathematics and science, that kind of stuff, the reason why a lot of kids perform poorly in those stuff is because they can't read well. They can't comprehend what's going on in math because their English is fairly weak. And so, and another big thing that Yang talked about is the same thing with people who do research in educational technology. Using technology in classrooms has nothing to do with educational technology, that's using it, right? the best technology could be a chalkboard, with a regular piece of chalk. So the idea of bringing these tech in the classroom and that kind of stuff, that's not really ed tech or learning sciences and tech. That's just pretty much doing the mundane stuff. It's like putting, brick and mortar instead of brick instead of mortar, but that's not typically how it's supposed to be done, because there's a huge disconnect between K-12 education. We know that for a fact. There's a huge disconnect between K-12 education and what research is showing. And that persists in the US because, as you said at the beginning of your talk, a lot of politicians have zero ideas about education, how people learn, but they're the ones driving it.
For sure, I appreciate what you say. Something else I want to add to that, and it brings up the question of creativity in US universities as well. Something that is so beautiful about the liberal arts education that I like to be reminded of myself is that we don't have to declare a major until the end of our second year. And in most countries, if you want to be a doctor, you have to kind of know by the time you're at the end of your elementary school, because then you have to plan what middle school you're going, and that sets you up, right? Whereas in this country, granted, you will be in school for longer, right? If you become a doctor, you don't have to make those decisions until later. And something that I would say, which is a problem, right? I mean, there's some schools that have no majors in the humanities these days, right? But I don't think there are many high schoolers who say, I'm going to be a religion major or a philosophy major. In those first 2 years of college, right? That's what it's for. You can shop around, and that's the beauty of, maybe you can be an engineer, but you can minor in philosophy or religion or whatever that is. And that is a beautiful part of the US system that really has kind of no equal elsewhere. Yeah.
Two comments. One I like about this system is late bloomers still have opportunities to happen. From high school to university, and they get in college, and it's like, woo, they take off. Oh, I'm sorry. But it's also something else that I learned when my son was in school. I went over to GAMP, which I think is called Gerard Academic Music Program. So I asked the guy, where do these students go after they graduate from